Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Mike Bird, who is the Wall Street editor at The Economist and the author of this new book right here called The Land Trap, a new history of the world's oldest asset. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I do a lot of programs for pension funds here in the U.S. and abroad. And of course, the whole topic is about investment strategy and different asset classes. And it's funny, but real estate is considered an alternative asset, right, in this world. And in some ways, that's kind of puzzling, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense if you understand the history of investable liquid securities and so forth. But in the broader historical thing, it seems a little weird because land has always been probably the most important and most valuable asset. And it certainly was probably the first asset that you could really invest in. And so I guess your book is trying to cover that entire sort of evolution, right? Which is in some ways the rise and fall of land as an investable asset, but maybe more importantly, the rise and fall of different types of liquid securities that are tied to land as an asset. So, I mean, do people really understand how central these securities are to the working of the contemporary financial system?
It's a great question. I think from writing and researching the book, my answer would be no. People have a good impression, especially financial professionals, of the scale of the mortgage market, for example. So they're not unaware of that. I think they're not unaware that real estate makes up a huge proportion of a lot of personal and household portfolios. When you look at it holistically, you know, what assets someone owns, I think it's still understated from that perspective. The fact that such a very large proportion, not just household, but non-financial corporate debt, is in one way or another tied to real estate. Just how real estate exposed and real estate focused banks are. All of this is especially true, in fact, outside of the US. The US, and I mentioned this in the book a little bit towards the end, for all the problems that the US has with its real estate market, with land and with the connection to finance, probably less so than really almost anywhere else in the world. And no, I'd say it's too little understood. And I think what people should have, or I'd like them to have, is a better understanding of the sort of unique ways that land operates and why it's different to other assets, after which I think everything starts to fall into place.
Yeah, I'm actually traveling to Saudi Arabia tomorrow, and they have just introduced mortgage-backed securities, right? At this late date. And you're thinking, wow, okay, how did they manage to go this long without mortgage-backed securities? I mean, it was in the Middle East where we had the very first, right, land deeds and land records, as you point out in the book. So, I mean, how important is the liquidification, is that a word? The liquefaction of claims on land. I mean, that seems to be a big part of your story, going all the way back to the creation of land banks, like in the colonial U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about land as an asset, there's a number of different things that are true of land. It's not just enormously valuable. It's not just enormously long-lived, which I think is part of the explanation for why it's so important in finance. It's very heterogeneous, right? You cannot exchange, swap a piece of land in downtown Manhattan for one in Montana. They are, funnily enough, not the same value. They need to be valued individually. They need to be assessed individually. So what you have is this huge bundle of very disparately valued bits of land all over the world. Huge demand in some places, huge interest in some places. In some parts of the world, you have very close monitoring of the price of land. In some places, you don't. The aggregated statistics in some places are great. Most of the world, they're pretty terrible. So you have this extraordinarily important but very disparate market. And then you have a history of attempts to, I think liquefy is the right word. I like liquefy as a word. To liquefy the market, which is to turn it into things which can be much more readily bought and sold, exchanged for cash, used as collateral, for example, and used in the everyday business of finance. So mortgage-backed securities, the very obvious version of this that we would talk about today, and the development of the mortgage-backed securities market really sort of professionalized real estate finance, and it's the bedrock of what allows banks, especially in the Western world, to be so finance focused. If you don't want to hold on to the risk and you're a mortgage lender, the mortgage-backed securities market is exactly what lets you sell it on to investors who need it. If you're the investor who needs it, it's exactly what allows you to get some sort of access to that market, to that level of risk. But if you go back to the really early days, colonial North America, I think, is the most interesting area for this. The reason it's particularly interesting is because colonial North America was extremely rich in land, extremely short on labor, and extremely short on cash. This is a thing, if you read almost any personal account of life in America in the 1600s and the early 1700s, really all the way up to sort of 1800 or so, the shortage of cash comes up over and over again, right?
They would use tobacco. They would use pretty much anything.
Wampum, right? They use shells. This is how crazy it was. You saw this all over the world, in various places that have been colonized, but I think it was particularly extreme in North America. Unlike South and Central America, no meaningful precious metals resources found by the colonists arriving. There's no real mining activities. They're not making their own supply of precious metals. They've basically got what comes back and forth on ships at that point from England. A little bit of circulating Spanish currency. It's a mess, basically. You're trying to conduct commerce without money, and that's difficult. And one of the things that comes up again and again as this sort of tiny kernel of an idea that is eventually exploited in really interesting ways is, but we have all this land, and the land is really valuable. And there's one particular writer, an English writer actually, who's picked up a lot in America, William Potter, who writes a book in 1650 called The Key of Wealth. And the Key of Wealth is basically a suggestion that if you can have a gold-backed currency, at this point, there are people in Europe using forms of paper money that are redeemable for gold, bills of credit and things like that. And William Potter looks at these and he says, well, if you can do this with gold, why can't you do it for land? Could you have a land-backed currency? And he envisions this because land is so much more valuable even at that point than gold. And during this process, the early 1700s in particular in the US, there is enormous experimentation in this, with public and private land banks, attempts to issue small-scale currencies backed by the value of effectively mortgage lending. So a local landowner would go to one of these financial institutions, get themselves a mortgage backed against the land. The bank, the lender, would issue currency, and the idea is it'll circulate, it'll boost commerce. Lots of financial innovation happening. It's really fascinating stuff, and I think it informs the story around the American Revolution a lot more than people think it does.
Samuel Adams. You talk about his family.
100%. Samuel Adams' dad bankrupted in a land banking venture that was essentially crushed by the British government. It is, in many ways, the origin of Samuel Adams's anti-British sentiments. This is actually not uncommon at all among founding fathers. A lot of them have stories like this of land speculation activities they were denied by the Crown, or land banking activities they were involved in that were frustrated by the Crown. It comes up again and again and again. Not a completely forgotten bit of American history, but certainly one that's been very much sidelined relative to others. And so this huge surplus in land wealth and a massive shortage of cash gives rise to all of this financial innovation, and really a lot of what we think of as, I would say, of modern banking is being experimented with here.
Well, you didn't mention the French revolutionaries, but in their assignat approach. But did they get that idea from the Americans?
It's a good question. That's a good question. The assignats, the reason that I don't look to that much is because there are a number of sort of French monetary schemes around the time, not all of which particularly successful. The origins of land banking, I mean, it goes back further, right? You can go to the Roman Empire had mortgage markets. There have been attempts to do this. I must admit, I don't know whether the idea for the assignats being land backed came from the US directly, but certainly at this point, it is the moment in which the world sort of realizes that this is possible. And it's really the US experience with lending against land in general that starts to inform what the rest of the world does. It's very difficult in England at the time, for example, and subsequently the United Kingdom. Very, very difficult to lend money against land in any significant volumes. And those restraints are eased and eased and eased, especially during the 19th century. Huge amount of change there. And a lot of it is based on watching the American experience and seeing what was possible.
Well, it seems like a precondition for the explosion of credit for the acquisition of land, right, requires the alienability of land, particularly if you're going to be issuing sort of land-backed currency. And so clear ownership and alienability, I mean, this is not something that we've always had. And even to this day, we don't have this in some places. To what extent was the pressure to finance land what was driving the evolution of property law in, say, England at the time?
I think a huge amount. And there's a lot of interesting research on this, on the contribution that land-based finance might have made to the early financing of the Industrial Revolution, for example, and how much sort of merchant pressure was involved there. I think the interesting thing happening in the UK is you have a social system that's slowly dying, and it's the social system, essentially an agricultural-based aristocracy.
But like the fee and tail and all that stuff you learn about in property law, that stuff was all disappearing, right?
Yeah, precisely. And I think it was a fairly fixed system. And the best way, I think, to understand this is that go back even further, go to, say, the 16th century and imagine a loan made by the Duke of Norfolk or any other, agricultural empire aristocrat, made to an Italian banker, London merchant, and imagine him defaulting on that. Is the Italian banker the Duke of Norfolk now? Does he does he recruit people for the crown? Does he have the aristocratic responsibilities over those parts of Eastern England? No, I mean that would be crazy. It doesn't fit with the aristocratic system at all. You had all sorts of very deep, what now looks like strange bits of property law. For example, as the owner, as the Duke of Norfolk or whoever else, you own the land. It doesn't mean you can borrow money against it. It also doesn't mean you can sell it, right? Your heirs, even unborn heirs, had rights to the property which would restrict you from doing much with it. So where you did see lending against land, you saw all sorts of strange arrangements. Like if someone defaulted on a loan that was secured against land, the lender might have the right to take the money that you made from the land for a certain number of years hence, right? You might get the agricultural yield. You were never going to possess the land. Now, obviously, these loans are insecure if the property rights aren't clear, but also if they're not transferable, or if it's not clear to what degree they're transferable. So all of these things frustrated land-based lending in England and in Europe more widely. The great thing about America in the 1600s and 1700s is no formal aristocracy. Huge proportion of people own land, and nobody has residual ancient rights. They can't say they're the Duke of anything, and I owe X, Y, Z to these people, and no, you can't take this portion of Connecticut from me. It's very much a sort of year zero, start again. And so you don't have those sort of social restrictions that really prevented this from emerging in England in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, if we fast forward, you mentioned De Soto, right, who was very influential in starting in the 1980s, right? And his position was that without clarity of ownership, without some kind of legal proof of ownership, then people wouldn't be able to borrow against their assets and start businesses and free up capital for all sorts of things, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And De Soto, I think I call him in the book, probably the most influential development economist of the 20th century and 21st century. And a lot of development economists will cringe at that because De Soto, he's a sort of, there's a lot of debate over the direction of causality here, right? I think nobody doubts that clear, transferable property rights that can be used for collateral are enormously important to economic development, right? That there is a clear relationship that rich countries have these rights and most poor ones don't. That's not controversial. The question is whether can you implement the rights and cause these huge bursts of growth. That was De Soto's argument. Lots of people disagree with that, but I don't think anyone disagrees with the sort of fact that to be rich, you have to have these sort of rights. And if you look at the impact that De Soto had, the degree of land formalization and titling over the past 50 years is absolutely astonishing in the developing world. You are going from a period in the 1980s when De Soto was writing, when really the vast majority of the world's land in the developing world was not titled at all, to a situation now, it's not all done, but a huge proportion of it, the vast majority of land formalization and titling the world over has been done in the last 40 or 50 years. So enormously influential and incredibly important ideas. And I think what he did land on was the absolutely key identification that rich countries had this and poor ones didn't. Not many economists get such a live, real experiment of whether their ideas work because it was adopted so widely.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's clear who the owner is and then you're just formalizing it, that's one thing. But when you have an environment where there's lots of kind of intertwangled ownership claims on the asset, and then you want to clarify it, then it seems like the way in which you clarify it is going to make a big difference. And you described what the British did in India, right, where they gave, I guess, fee simple to certain very powerful people who previously had more of a quasi-governmental claim, right?
Yes. This is the zamindar system. Yeah. So it's this fascinating system. So this class of people existed under the Mughal Empire, and they were basically sort of warlords at the time, right? And they existed in a very sort of splintered way. The British formalized this system.
Tax collectors, right?
Yes, exactly. You guys don't get to be warlords anymore. That's our job. We're not going to have any sort of local warlords, but we would like you to collect the tax. And this works extremely well for the British Empire, which always and everywhere was extremely low on administration. We weren't sending tens of thousands of civil servants from the UK to run everything, and had no intention of doing that in India. The idea was to harness local social systems and to get them to work in favor of the British Empire. Towards the end of the British Empire in India, this becomes a big problem. And it becomes a big area of focus for Indian politicians when India is newly independent, because the zamindars, funnily enough, have become an enormously hated social class of tax collectors. They're in many ways, in the same way that feudal landlords do all over the world, have abused their status in lots and lots of ways. But it also becomes a sort of rallying point for rural India against the British Empire. That the Congress, the Indian independence movement, had always been quite urban and struggled initially to sort of harness approval and support in rural India. And they managed to do this through identifying the zamindars. Okay, you may not know the British, you may not know what's going on in the cities, but you know this guy. He's the tax collector and he's the representative of the British. And it was an enormous and important part of, anti-British sentiment running up to Indian independence. And I think, to me, that speaks to something wider that comes up a few times in the book and comes up with land again and again, that these sort of ownership decisions often have huge, huge political consequences that people don't quite put enough onus on.
Yeah, I want to talk about land reform, but of course, in some countries, you don't need it. So in most of the Midwest in the U.S., right, we've never had a land reform movement because corporations in many states weren't even allowed to own land, right? So our system of granting relatively small claims, I mean, in the U.S. context, small, big in European context, but giving these smallholders relatively family farm-sized properties. This was, I think, critical to the preservation of a democratic system, right? Because you didn't allow for the concentration of land ownership in the Midwest until fairly recently.
Absolutely. And I think, funnily enough, the US has never done a sort of land reform program. Essentially what we're talking about is the mass redistribution of land to a much
I mean,
bigger group of people.
I suppose it could have in the post-Civil War period, because that was probably in the South was
Yes.
probably the only area where you had sort of a landed gentry, right?
Yeah, and possible that had Reconstruction gone on longer, you might have seen something like that. But you I think hit the nail on the head in that when you describe the grants given to smallholders and the understanding that you really had to sort of homestead and live on and use the land, right? You couldn't just turn up and plant a flag and say, well, I'll have everything from, you know, this edge of Montana to that edge of Wyoming because I got here first, right? That wasn't permitted. It had to be staggered out. You had to live on it. You had to make some use of the land. Is in many ways you're starting from the land reform principle from the get-go, right? That it has to be relatively well distributed. So you partly don't need it because you've begun with that very principle in mind. Yeah.
Well, California might have been a little different. I don't know the exact details, but I think there were these large estates owned by Spanish sort of cattle folks, and they wound up getting broken up. But I don't know whether that was an entirely voluntary process. I think there may have been a little bit of persuasion and coercion involved.
I think so. And California, I don't know a huge amount about the Californian, the really early settlement. But obviously, the one of the big differences is people got to California sort of first, right?
Well, but the Spanish were here,
yeah.
and they had these big. So I think when the gold miners showed up, they just kind of a lot of them just didn't respect the titles that the Mexican government had handed out to these folks.
There you go. That's and I think when you look at the settlement of the further west parts of the Midwest and the West, sort of ex-California, you see a lot more of that sort of staggered, slightly more organized process. I read a bunch about the Oklahoma land rush that didn't really make it into the book, but these fascinating processes of setting up rules by which you would have people literally sort of stood on a starting line for the last little bits of not even necessarily unoccupied, but untitled land in the United States. Firing a starting gun, basically, you'd rush as far as you could into these unoccupied portions, and you had to prove you were sort of resident on it at some point shortly afterwards. It's all very organized, all very formalized in a way that the early settlement wasn't at all.
Yeah, I think you allude to the beard hypothesis, right? Where America was different because land was not in finite supply, at least until, I guess there was a specific date when they announced that the frontier was over, right? And then we kind of became just like any other country in that respect.
Totally. I mean, any other country, America, even today, is still extraordinarily rich in land, and I think more and more about this since writing the book. The constraints on the US, they're apparent. I live in New York City. It's, you go to California, it's very clear where the constraints on land are. But there's a huge proportion of the country and the productive, high-income parts of the country where that's really not true. Whereas you look at somewhere like the UK, and it's really all of the high productivity, high income parts of the country are incredibly land constrained. You have that sort of vice-like effect, much more so. But definitely in the US, you see the political dynamics start to transform in the sort of 1870s, 80s, 90s, when, the frontier is effectively gone. What land is left is not very good. It's not very valuable. There's not much of it. And basically, the country is now functionally occupied. You change that later with technology and stuff. But yeah, the politics of the US, I think, changes considerably, the domestic politics at that period.
Yeah, the political divide in America kind of lines up with the divide between places where land is abundant and where land is constrained, right? So if you go to some parts of the Midwest and part of the South, you go to parts of Texas, I mean, they're just got these developers and they just go and grab a gigantic, huge swath of farmland. And within a few years, they'll turn it into 1,000 tract homes, right? And then they'll offer them up for sale at relatively reasonable terms. And it's affordable to people who are in the middle class. And in places like New York and San Francisco, right? I mean, the housing supply is constrained in a major way, primarily due to legal restrictions. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it's I mean, it's funny because there's an attitude, and this emerged very much in the 1880s, 1890s with Henry George. There's a sort of residual idea that something is going on in California, in New York, with the greedy landlords. The landowners are doing this in some way, and there's an element of people who own property resist it being built elsewhere.
I think
But
now it's homeowners, right?
yeah, totally. It's homeowners, it's individual homeowners. Everyone I know who owns commercial, large tracts of investable land will be very happy to have the permission to build extraordinarily extensively on that land, right? This is sort of monopoly level windfall to them. As you say, it's legal and regulatory restriction really now that prevents that from happening. There were all sorts of theories in the late 19th, early 20th century about people deliberately sitting on land and keeping it fallow in a speculative way. I don't think that's a huge issue now. The change has been that it's a regulatory constriction. It's a local political constraint.
I think a big character in your book is Henry George, and it's kind of hard for people today, particularly economists, to appreciate how important this guy was. I mean, what you said, he was the second bestseller after the Bible
Yeah.
in the 19th century. I mean, it's crazy, and so he's completely disappeared off the radar of most economists.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, people have referred in the past to Henry George as the last classical economist, and I think that's a really good way of putting it. He lives in this space immediately before the widespread professionalization of economics. So you have people working in the UK and the US at that point to invent something that's much more structured, much more mathematical, much more formal. You have marginalism, which is already fully developed in Europe. There's lots of thinking around that. And then you have Henry George, who is really, sort of autodidact, self-educated, working from first principles and publishing sort of moral political economy. He writes a book in 1879 called Progress and Poverty. And he basically says, you can see all of the progress in the world, all the technological developments, everything that's great. Why don't you feel better off? And his answer is that landlords are sapping it all, that essentially any improvements in the human condition, once land is widely owned and settled, any improvements just flow into rents and go to landlords. And in America, in the 1880s and 1890s, if you live in somewhere like California, if you live in New York, this sounds pretty convincing. Even if you live in rural America, where people are interacting with very, very powerful railroad companies that are buying up land and trying to expand, and a lot of sort of spivvy, dangerous, speculative financial games happening in rural America at the time, this all sounds pretty convincing. Henry George he's an economist, but really it's almost better to think of him as like a quasi-religious figure. He sort of lights up the US with this very moral, biblical language about people's rights being denied to them. He becomes enormous internationally, becomes a huge figure in the UK. He does lecture tours in Australia, which, you can imagine the difficulty of getting to somewhere like Australia and spreading your ideas from the US. He runs for mayor of New York twice. Misses out sort of surprisingly narrowly the first time and dies in the process of doing it the second time. Spreads this ideology even after his death called Georgism. The idea being the underlying problem is in the land, and it needs to be taxed very aggressively to resolve this issue. And then, as you allude, by the sort of 1930s, this idea which has lit up mostly center-left, but not exclusively center-left politics, or in lots of different parts of the world, is in sort of freefall. It's in a state of almost total collapse. And by the middle of the 20th century, it's really not a relevant or important idea. It's been relegated to the fringes, which is where it remains today. In fact, it's probably a little bit better known today than it was in the middle of the 20th century. It's this fascinating process, and I can understand why people just haven't heard of this guy.
But But it seems like, I mean, it's not that he was completely discredited as much as some of his insights were made mainstream, right? So people thought he was a radical and a left winger, but the Marxists, right, they had no time for him
No.
because in a way he wanted to preserve capitalism by democratizing land ownership. And this actually became the platform of both Henry Hoover and Herbert Hoover, sorry, Herbert Hoover and FDR, right? They both actually supported this idea, except they did it by making it easier for people to own their own homes, right?
Absolutely. So the Henry George, his ideas are basically torn to pieces. They do not find a political home, or rather they're ripped into bits. In the early 20th century, the rise of communism on the left has no special role for land. Land's just capital. You know, they want to see landowners dispossessed, but that's true of everyone. Property, full stop, not just land, is theft in communist thinking. And then on the right, you get the backlash, which has two components to it. One is skepticism of redistribution, even if it's just land. There's an element on the right by the early 20th century that hears this and just thinks communism, Marxism, I'm not getting involved with this. And they come up with their own idea, which is large-scale, subsidized, government-assisted, but still private land and home ownership. Basically, the very simple understanding that conservatives are people who have something to conserve. And if you give them something to conserve, we can expand that base of voters, that group of people. And honestly, it works for the large part in the UK and the US. This process goes on. It goes on in lots of other parts of the world. And largely it works. And it destroys the constituency for Georgism, which is either ripped off into much further left thinking that doesn't have a role for land, or thinking on the more sort of conservative center-right. You know, Henry George had this, what sounds today like a strange grab bag of views. I enjoy it because it's relatively close in the grand scheme of things to my own views on things. Land is a special asset. You can't let people just have the windfall gains of land. There's lots of social contribution that goes into the value of land. You can't have, for example, the public funding an infrastructure project and all the benefits of the infrastructure project going straight into the hands of landowners. That's not right. But he's also basically a libertarian on every other issue. He's a free trader. He's one of the most cogent, liquid advocates of free trade in the late 19th century in the US. He doesn't want significant government involvement in, frankly, anything else. He finds himself allied with all of these labor movements, despite not really believing in the labor movement at all, not thinking that that sort of general strikes are going to bring the US working class prosperity. And so, yeah, his politics are just torn to pieces, basically. It just doesn't find a home in the US. It doesn't last.
Yeah, I mean, most economists, I think, would be very critical of our current regime, which subsidizes home ownership, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we subsidize debt financing, we subsidize, right, mortgage payments, we discourage rental, we discourage equity finance. And for a lot of reasons, we might think this is going to lead to distortions. But apart from just satisfying the vested interests of homeowners, I mean, I think part of this is driven by this idea of a homeowner democracy, right? I mean, is that still valid in today's world? Does it still make sense, or do the costs outweigh the benefits? Because once we give people this vested interest in the preservation of their land value, then they do all sorts of things to kind of build fences so that others can't get into the same position.
Totally. And I think the position we're in now, I would say the costs outweigh the benefits. And I would especially say that if you'd thought this through in 1925, in 1935, the era in which these things were really getting off the ground, you probably could have seen this coming if you'd really thought about it. Now, I understand why the UK is an even more extreme example than the US, because the US has always had fairly widespread land ownership. It rose significantly in the 20th century with home ownership. But the UK, something like maybe 10% of people lived in their own homes around the time of World War I. And then by the 1990s, we're talking about 65%. owner-occupiers. So this is a total transformation of the structure of the country. Now, once you get to 65%, once you get to over 50% or any high number, you're going to see problems because you've made the home a very large proportion of someone's portfolio. And a lot of the time, a lot of places in the world, one that has gone up in price at a relatively rapid rate. So they've enjoyed that. It's a big element of security to them. They're not going to vote to get rid of that or to undermine it in any way. You then have generations of people coming up behind them for whom, because of the exact same effect, home ownership is now much more expensive and much more difficult to achieve. So it's very much at this point, it starts to have zero-sum attributes. To enable people to own homes, would-be home buyers, younger people, you have to in some way disadvantage or slow the gains, at least, of the existing homeowners, because there's no more land to snap up. And if you won't build anything more, then this is just going to be how it works. So I think the costs do outweigh the benefits. I think, especially outside of the US, they've done far worse consequences as well in terms of driving so much investment into housing and keeping it out of more productive activities, which I think is a huge and important part of the book. And it's true in the US, but it's much more true elsewhere too.
Well, in England, you also have this strange thing where you have like a 99-year lease. I know a lot of people that live in like Kensington, and their leases are coming up pretty soon. They've invested a huge amount in these properties, and then they realize, oh crap, we're going to have to turn this back over to the Duke of Westminster, whoever it is that owns this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny because I've really enjoyed this since because as a British person, leasehold seems like a perfectly normal thing to me. Somebody owns the land, and essentially what you're buying is an extraordinarily long-term rental contract. And I think there's lots of ways, actually, we can talk about this maybe, but I go into Singapore in the book in the ways that this can be used in an extremely productive, useful way for a small, crowded country. But it's the new world where obviously leasehold is sort of anathema. And I think particularly to Americans, I've spoken to so many people who say, this isn't really how it works, is it? You buy it for 99 years and then they actually take it back from you afterwards, and you don't really own it. It's anathema to the sort of American ideal, as much as I think it's a useful financial tool. I also think it's a useful tool in terms of, you've been to Kensington, it's a nice place, right? A lot of the houses look very, very similar. It's orderly. It's got nice stores and well laid out neighborhoods. That's partly because it's owned by a single unitary owner. That's not happenstance. The fact that it doesn't look messy or sort of higgledy-piggledy is because there's a single owner, and the leasehold works pretty well. That said, obviously, this model means that some of those people you're renting from in central London are some of the very oldest fortunes in the world. You mentioned the Duke of Westminster. He has one of the very oldest fortunes in the world, one of the very few aristocratic families that own significant land in central London. Most of them owned agricultural land that collapsed in value. So he's sitting on investments that were made centuries and centuries ago, which have gone up in value because of where they are. So there's downsides and there's upsides, but I do find the difference between the English or European way of thinking about it, or even in some cases the Asian way of thinking about it, and the US and the New World in general, where it's seen as much more outrageous.
Well, the parts of the book that I learned the most from are the parts having to do with Asia, and it's clear that you spent a lot of your career in Asia. And part of that story is the story of land reform and how the land reform trajectories were very different in different countries. And this guy, what was his name? Ladijinsky?
Yeah, Wolf Ladijinsky. Yes.
What a fascinating character. I'd never heard of this guy.
He's a great character, and I think he's a really understated. He's a man who genuinely changed the shape of the 20th century, especially in Asia. I think the reason I liked writing about him is because he shouldn't, in any normal world, he wouldn't have been this guy, right? Wolf Ladijinsky is born very early 20th century, end of the 19th century, in Ukraine. He's a Jewish Ukrainian. His family are landlords, and he flees Ukraine during the Russian Civil War. So the Bolsheviks are taking over Russia, become the Soviet Union, and he gets out and he goes to the US and he studies economics in New York, and he becomes an agricultural economist, and he works for the Department of Agriculture. And honestly, in any other world, that's where the story ends, right? This is not a department or a part of the Department of Agriculture where many people sort of change the world. It's not known for producing these visionary leaders. But Wolf Ladyshinsky starts focusing on Asian agriculture and Asian rural economies in general. And at the end of the Second World War, this is suddenly immediately and very sharply relevant. You have a devastated portion of East Asia that has been at war for, considerably longer than anyone's been at war for in Europe.
Kind of like a blank slate almost. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. And I think the blank slate is an important part of it. You have a US military administration running the Japanese government, essentially. And people like Wolf Ladyshinsky have enormous influence precisely because you don't have to go through the normal political means to get things done. You have Douglas MacArthur, who is running Japan with as close to the powers of a sort of autocratic monarch as any American has ever wielded anywhere. I genuinely think probably the most powerful American in any country in the world up to that point and since was Douglas MacArthur. Very few sort of checks on his behavior. Wolf Ladyshinsky and a bunch of other reformers convince him that a big problem in Japan is concentrated land ownership, that it has a sort of semi-feudal relationship with land, huge number of tenant farmers that have no investment in the Japanese agricultural system, a lot of absentee landlords. They essentially paint a picture that this is like, medieval Europe. And Douglas MacArthur buys the idea. And he forces the Japanese government to institute this extremely aggressive land reform, land redistribution, away from the existing owners and towards the tenants. Wolf Ladyshinsky then repeats this in a number of different Asian locations and tries to repeat it in a number more. But it's this transformative idea, and it's actually a big part of US foreign policy during the post-war couple of decades. It's a huge thing that the US is advocating for, and you can sort of see why. Again, the American spirit, the sort of deep prioritization of individual land ownership and widespread land ownership is now promoted overseas as well. And you see, these huge redistribution campaigns, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, really, really transformative stuff.
And this was meant to keep the communists at bay in large part, right? Because they would make false promises of land ownership to these disenfranchised people. And this was essentially going to kind of mute that appeal, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And Wolf Ladyshinsky was essentially able to say from a position of personal knowledge, I've seen this story before. The communists go into rural areas, tell people the landlord is a capitalist as well. We're going to dispossess him and all the other capitalists, and you're going to get the land. And local tenant farmers, peasants hear this and say, well, I don't know much about communism, but that sounds good to me. They support these movements. Often the land is redistributed, only for a few years later to be taken back and collectivized. This is a story in pretty much every communist country, really. It happened in Russia, it happened in China, happened in North Korea. And a big selling point that Ladyshinsky made was you might be personally uncomfortable with this redistribution. It might sound icky to you if you're a big respect for property rights, if you're on the political right. It's me or Chairman Mao at this point, right? We're not talking about what you'd prefer in an ideal situation. It's this or the peasants join the communist movements in various countries. And people found that pretty convincing. It also dulls the political opposition, right, if you're a landlord. If that's your choice, it's not a difficult one.
Well, I mean, they weren't appropriated without compensation, right? So a lot of these landlords, they got government bonds. And so having a government bond now meant that your interests were in preserving the the government, right?
Yes,
If you wanted to
yes,
get
that
paid.
is true. That is
Kind of
true.
like Hamilton
I mean,
did with widespread ownership of government bonds.
no, that is very true. And there were binding elements there, and in places, certain places, people might have received shares in like government-owned industries and things like that. There was compensation. I mean, the difficulty is you got compensation, but you didn't get to choose whether you got the compensation, right? I think it's fair to say the vast majority of these landowners were paid not just significantly less than they would have liked, but significantly less really than any fair estimate of their assets would have priced them at. But the political circumstances were unique, and I think this is something that someone like myself that does think, extremely strong property rights systems are really important, has to tackle with. That when these sort of moments of expropriation are really focused on land quite tightly, they don't spread over into sort of general expropriative attitudes. They can have seemingly really positive impacts. So lots of people credit land reform in Japan in particular with sort of establishing the basis of a democratic society, of massively accelerating the education boost in Japan. If you're a tenant farmer and you're given land yourself, you're able to actually invest in it, and you want to make the most of it because it's no longer the landlord taking it from you. The surplus you create is your own. Most of those people used the extra money they made to massively accelerate the education of their children. This generation of people in Japan becomes a more educated one, which fuels the economic development that happens 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. So the spillover effect from land reform is really quite large.
It seems to be a big part of the Asian miracle, one that's not really discussed all that much. But you also mentioned Sun Yat-sen, right? And he was a Georgist. And did I read correctly that Georgia's principles are baked into the Taiwan Constitution? Is that right?
Yes, they are. Sadly, not as closely observed in Taiwan as I would like them to be. But Sun Yat-sen is this fascinating figure precisely because he's one of a cohort of international revolutionaries at the turn of the 20th century, who is profoundly international. He's Chinese, but he spent a huge proportion of his life outside of China, traveling all over the place. He pops up again and again. In London is where he comes across Henry George's writing and inhales it, and basically comes to believe, he doesn't adopt it wholesale, but he takes sort of 80% of it and tries to put it in the context of China and says we need what he calls the equalization of land rights, which is the bit that's now in the Taiwanese constitution. It becomes one of the founding pieces of dogma for the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party that Sun Yat-sen leads. And so the residual element of it is still there. Sun Yat-sen was a huge nerd for what it's worth. It's really, really enjoyable to go and read his writing. It's like a sort of series of 200 Brookings papers stapled together a lot of the time. He has these really, really in-depth ideas about how to use land value to finance infrastructure that, the president and potential president of a country has no real business, thinking about directly. But yeah, he's obsessed with these ideas, and the idea of using land value uplift for financing all sorts of things. He's very deep in.
And you discuss, of course, the pretty visible contrast between Hong Kong and Singapore, and you've lived in both places. Hong Kong's kind of famous for having like the least affordable housing on the planet, right, relative to income. And yet in Singapore, it's not a problem. How can these two places be so similar and yet so radically different when it comes to housing?
This is one of the fascinating things to me because I did live in these two places. I lived in Hong Kong for 4 years and Singapore for 3, and they started out with really very, very similar governance, okay? They're both British Crown colonies. They're both established as trading posts, really. They're both really populated in the same way by people regionally moving towards these areas where there is no sort of oppressive leadership, where free trade is possible, where taxes are low. They become magnets for people all over the place. And they begin with these land financing models, which, as with the zamindars in India, British colonial authorities always looking for the easiest possible way of administrating a tax system and running things. And in Singapore and Hong Kong, that's land. Very easy to map out. They're not big places. You can sell it, you keep the maps, you keep it registered, but you don't need to pay that much attention otherwise. You use the money for the financing of the local government, and especially for sort of building out these cities. And that's exactly what they both do. And then in the middle of the 20th century, they sort of head off in other directions. Singapore is heading towards independence and Hong Kong isn't. And they end up with these very, very different land financing models, both of them still using land as a sort of huge economic tool. The difference is Hong Kong uses it to raise money and continues to do that, right? Their attitude is you raise as much money from these land sales as possible, and you use it for whatever's needed, right? And Singapore's attitude is you use the widespread land ownership, and they, develop some very acquisitive ways of expropriating more land, buying up privately owned land for very little money. Their attitude was that you have to sort of maximize the home ownership rate, basically. And it's these two different goals heading in two different directions that leave you with this gulf now between, as you say, in the sort of basically outside of mainland China, Hong Kong is the most expensive place in the world to live. If you look at relative to incomes, if you look at the absolute price per square foot, it's astonishing. In Singapore, there is a public-private sort of mesh system unique to Singapore, run by a department called the Housing and Development Board. Essentially, Singaporeans are able to purchase one semi-government owned apartment, and only one. They're given extremely preferential financing for getting access to that. They can sell it on only to other citizens or residents that don't currently have one. Lots of these are bought through what's called build to order. So you buy it ahead of it being built, and it's built somewhere. There's a sort of internal market. They vary in price, they vary in size, and it means that the country has a sort of 90 or so percent home ownership rate. And actually, land and housing isn't a large part of Singaporean household wealth, whereas in Hong Kong, the home ownership rate is sub 50%, and housing wealth is by overwhelmingly the majority of household wealth. So you've headed off in these two drastically different directions from very, very similar beginnings on what might seem actually at the sort of diversion point to be small differences have compounded in this very, very, to me, because I've lived in both places, a very interesting way.
It's kind of like Stanford faculty housing, right? Where you can only sell it to other Stanford faculty. And so the prices are low and lower than they would be otherwise.
Well, there you go. I didn't know that. But that's it. Imagine if a nation had Stanford faculty housing. And, when I lived in Singapore, this isn't true for expat residents. I paid market rates for a rental property in Singapore. It's about 15% private home ownership. So you typically live in one of those buildings if you're a foreign temporary resident. And it was very expensive. And you look at the private housing in Singapore, and it's extraordinarily expensive. It's just they've created this sort of high garden wall around an area that they don't allow unrestricted capital flows into, that they don't allow sort of monopolized ownership of. And it works incredibly well for the country. I actually think it's the reason that Singapore is able to be otherwise pretty low tax, relatively limited redistribution, free trading, and sort of open to the world's capital and many of the world's people, is because the effects of doing that don't seriously affect the housing market in the way that they do in other countries.
Now, of course, you also talk about financial crises, and it seems like land is at the heart of a lot of these financial crises. This is actually a little bit difficult for me to understand. I teach a course on behavioral finance, and I spend a lot of time talking about bubbles and crashes. And I get it, right? Back in the 1830s, when the railroad boom happened, there's going to be a land bubble. But when we fast forward to the present and we look at what happened in Japan in 1990 or so, and when we look at what happened in the U.S. in 2006 through 8, it's kind of astonishing that you could have an asset that is this well understood at the heart of a bubble and a crash, right? And so it seems like, I mean, is real estate the problem, or is it really debt financing that is the problem? Because that's really where it seems like real estate is the place where you have the most debt financing, right?
Yeah.
If real estate was all equity financed, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, completely. And I think actually in the depths of the Singapore system, there's something to that. And essentially that the government is sort of, arguably you say it ends up looking like the government is doing equity financing on people's behalves. I would say, I think half the answer here is behavioral and slightly irrational and sort of social. And half the answer is deeply rational and makes sense to like any student of finance. The side that's irrational is home and land ownership has a reputation and a status that other asset ownership doesn't have, right? You have people who say they don't want to form a family until they can own a home. That's a fairly common sentiment in large parts of the world. Nobody says I've got to own $300,000 in my S&P 500 ETF, or I'm not starting a family, right? It's not a common thing. There's a sense of status, security, middle class, belonging that comes through owning a home, which makes it very unusual. And I think this digs into a deep historical thing about sort of freedom from feudalism, from living under a landlord, from living in sort of someone else's pocket. So there's that side of things. And I think you can end up with irrational behavior there because people want real estate more than its value strictly as an asset should give it. And you can see this by the fact that people want a home. They don't want to own an equivalent value in REITs, for example, and then rent. That's a very unpopular option. The side of this that I think is deeply rational goes into the absolute, it's the fact that land doesn't depreciate. So if you think about how you price an asset, right, you're thinking about a bond, for example. You think about the cash flows that you get for the life of the bond, and then the bond is going to mature, and then you get your money back. And depending on what prevailing interest rates are and what you think inflation is going to be and your other options, you can price what you think this bond is worth to you based on its cash flows and based on its value. With land, the Duke of Westminster being a great example of this, what's the maturity? It doesn't mature. Could be 100 years, could be 400 years. You know, if the land stays valuable, if it stays in a place that is valuable, and I think the reason I think Japan is a really good example of this, the one that you mentioned, is because Japan was going through extraordinarily rapid growth at the time. So pricing the flow of rents or income or value from a piece of land when the economy is growing 10, 12% a year is really, really tough. Any slowdown or acceleration is going to very dramatically change the price of the asset because you're pricing out income coming way further into the future.
So in a way, every home buyer is kind of like a closet Georgist, right? Because they think that all of the benefits of growth will ultimately kind of flow back to real estate prices.
A little bit. And I think there's an element of this. You know, you hear the old aphorisms. I've had enough arguments with my own family members about the virtue of buying property. There's lots of people who think it's a virtuous thing to buy, and also that it provides these enormous financial gains that lock you in. I love the old, it's the sort of real estate developer of Georgism, which is they're not building any more of it, right? They're not making any more land, which within it contains the seed of what George was talking about, but is flipped around to mean you should buy as much of it as you can because it's a great asset to own. I think that the reason it comes up in financial crises all the time is these two, the irrational side of it and the rational side. A small disruption to the rational side of things, I think, can throw any lending that's been done against the asset off aggressively. This is exactly what happened in Japan. There was a lot of irrationality, but no small part of it was down to the fact that Japan's growth rate slowed, and a lot of these assets have been priced as if that would not happen.
Now, you didn't mention Case Shiller, but what I found fascinating is when they finally put together a real estate index, it appears as if real estate prices have not gone up anywhere nearly as much as everybody thinks, right? There seems to be a disconnect between our belief in the ever rising value of property. And when you look over the long haul, it doesn't seem to be going up by nearly as much as we think.
No, that's true. And I think certainly in the US, one of the things that comes out in the reporting and the research for the book is that the US is actually quite lucky in this instance. There are certainly parts of the country where obviously you've been, buying land has been a really good investment, even relative to your other opportunities. If you had the opportunity to go back and buy land in San Francisco 40 years ago, you should borrow every penny you can possibly get your hands on to do that. Same in parts of New York.
But not Cleveland.
No, not Cleveland, not Detroit, not a lot of the country. And obviously what you can't buy, unless you're buying an extremely well-diversified REIT, for example, you can't buy a US house, right? It has to be somewhere. You're plugging into the opportunities and rewards or punishment of a local economy. And so, no, I'm not enormously surprised at that. I think the thing that's unique in the US relative to the rest of the world is just how well you can do and have done historically investing in listed equities, right? Investing in risk assets and getting the compounded returns relative to home ownership, which I think is massively to America's credit. This is not true in large portions of the rest of the world. It's not true in large parts of Europe. It hasn't always been true in the UK. It's certainly not true in large parts of Asia, where local listed equity markets have been very unreliable, especially China, and housing has been a much better bet.
Well, Mike, thanks so much. This is a fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. And I know you probably have enough content in your head. You could have made it twice as long. So the book is called Land Trap. Check it out.
Thanks very much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.